Great. Thanks so much, Richard, and for having me, and also for coming in at what I know is, a busy term for many of you, coming up to the end and exam season and all the things that are happening at this point in Trinity term. So thank you for joining tonight. I was instructed to give a little bit of a background to who I am, why I'm here. And that kind of starts with where I grew up. And we'll talk tonight about connections to place. And for me, home is the lands of the Kaurna people in the Adelaide Hills in Australia. That's what this looks like. So that's where I grew up and feel very, very connected to that place, to the smell of the gum trees, to the rocks and trees and landscapes there. And this is the context of family in which I grew up as well. So I grew up with 4 younger sisters. I'm the shortest in the middle, as you can see. They were all very happy when they, got past me one by one. And my home is surrounded by wildlife. So I've been very lucky that, there's very loud bird song, there's koalas kind of literally on our doorstep sometimes. My sister opened one day and there was one right there. This is on our driveway. They're a very frequent visitor, so we have very regular sightings all the time. And I'll talk a little bit about what it's been like to witness some of the effects on those natural environments as well. But it was that context and that sense of deep connection and interconnection with the natural world that I was lucky to have very inherent to my childhood. I studied chemistry and physics originally, which is quite away from what we're going to talk about tonight. But there are many different threads and disciplines that have intersected in my work and life. And that's really part of what Richard was saying, that the topics I'm going to be discussing are also really interdisciplinary and really intersecting between medicine and psychology and neuroscience and climate and environment. And so that's also been part of my trajectory. So yeah, I was working with lasers and all sorts of things before I ran away to join the circus. So I was part of a science circus and I got to travel around Australia in the context of studying science communication. Got to play with a lot of bubbles and slime and liquid nitrogen, including in Indigenous communities in the Northern Territory in Australia and in remote and regional areas where Australia is a very, very big place. And unlike the UK, you sometimes have to drive for many, many days to get from some of the farms and the communities where kids grow up to kind of a regional centre or place where they could access kind of a museum or have people visit their school. So we got to bring some science to them and get to engage with, we had farmers coming and many different kinds of communities, and that was a real pleasure and privilege. And then I came to Oxford in part driven by many different questions. One of them was I had my own lived experience of quite severe mental health challenges first as a teenager, and that was initially like 25 years ago when I was first diagnosed, and the context of what it meant to live with a mental health issue was very, very different and very highly stigmatized compared to what it is today. Luckily, I mean, there's still that stigma exists, but the only thing my kind of 14-year-old brain knew about mental health was a person kind of in a straitjacket in an asylum, like very much kind of crazy versus normal. And so what that meant for me in my life and my future and what my future would look like was something that was extremely challenging to wrap my head around and felt very lonely and alone, as well as going through the distress of the illness itself. And that was in part why I wanted to study neuroscience. Also, I was interested in questions like, why are we here? What is consciousness? What is a bird? What is it like to be a bird? All of these kind of questions. And then you come to study neuroscience, and I think the field is changing, but initially I was like, I'm really interested in consciousness. And people was like, no, we don't actually talk about that here. We don't study that here. But it is changing a bit. So I came over in 2012 and did my master's and then DPhil in neuroscience. My DPhil was understanding how we process uncertainty in the brain, which will be another theme I'll kind of come back to in the talk. Alongside my DPhil, I got to work with students across Oxford to set up something called It Gets Brighter, which was a platform for young people to share, well, for anyone to share video messages of hope and support for young people. When we started in 2013, all of the kind of platforms where people are now sharing TikTok videos or anything like that around their mental health challenges and what helps them, that wasn't really available. And so this was a way for people to get access to like moderated content that could help see that they weren't alone in what they were going through, and give them a better sense for the future. And we had videos come in from around the world, including from celebrities, the Archbishop of Canterbury, you know, comedians, all sorts, students. And yeah, it was quite a wild ride learning to set up a charity and do all of this with students kind of alongside studies. But it was a real pleasure and a privilege as well. And then I got a job at Imperial College working on mental health research. And this was I started the job at the start of 2019. And, you know, this was the year school strikes were happening around the world. But I personally was really struggling with the context of knowing climate change was happening, being a physicist, having studied at Oxford and gone to a lot of the Oxford Climate Research Network talks and Oxford Student Society, Climate Society talks. And at all of those talks, it would be like, okay, this is what we need to do from our economic policy or our technologies, and this is the plan. But the key was like, well, why aren't we doing it? What's the gap here? Why aren't we acting as a society, as a species, to then enact this? And I was really struggling with that. But I was also working in a context where people were talking all around me about youth mental health being this rising challenge, where when it's measured, rates of emotional distress seem to be rising, self-harm is rising, and this seems to be not only being more reported, but actually rising in real terms. And there's a lot of work saying we need environments that are mental health promoting and supporting, but I wasn't hearing anyone say, well, what does that mean in the context of youth mental health when there are these compounding global challenges? You know, just been Brexit, there was rising uncertainty, climate change, etc. What did that mean for young people's mental health? And the finger was very much pointed at social media or school pressures, which are all relevant, but it was no focus on, well, what is this wider context? And at the same time, all of this research is kind of coming out saying, we're running out of time to take the actions needed to safeguard a livable future. And the climate crisis is ultimately a result of human behaviour, and taking action requires us to change and transform behaviours and systems and societies. And what do we know about this from a psychological perspective? So I started looking into this, and at the time there were no papers about youth mental health in the context of climate change, which may be surprising today because it's a very rapidly growing area. And so I started sort of looking into that myself, and I'll tell you more about that, but also just to say why I'm also driven to this work. So over the last years in Adelaide, where I'm from, there's already been huge changes. So there's always been heat waves, there's always been issues, but now we have like an algal bloom that has killed millions of sea creatures. You can see in the right-hand corner, we've had millions of sea creatures washing up dead on the beach due to this algal bloom and environmental change. We've had extreme heat waves and droughts. My nephew Zoe here, niece Zoe, came home in January from the hospital where she was born in 46-degree heat. And modelling suggests that my nephews and niece will experience 7 times the number of heat waves as my parents in already a very hot context. So I started trying to understand these connections between the health of our climate and the health of our minds, and both in bidirectional. And that was something that I have to say in 2019, people would be completely confused with what are you trying to do? What are you trying to talk about? And it's changed very, very rapidly. But we got to go, for instance, to COP in Glasgow, and we were the first ever mental health event at a climate COP conference. So before then, no one had actually been talking about this. in that context. And then over those intervening years, I set up the Climate Care Centre at Imperial and got to do a lot of fun things with a lot of communities around the world, which I can talk a little bit to more later. And just to say that's the background context to which I come to Oxford. So what we're trying to do at Climate Cares is protect mental health and strengthen psychosocial resilience in a changing climate and enable climate action that benefits mental health and well-being. And this talk will try and tell you a little bit more about what that means, why that matters, and what does that mean for you. So I just wanted to quickly see a little bit of audience interaction. You're all here, you've chosen to be here, I hope. What do you think of when you think about climate change? What comes to mind? Yes? Terror and paralysis. Thanks for sharing that. Anyone want to add?
Dead coral reefs.
Dead coral reefs.
Fears for the future.
Fears for the future. Yeah. So that's pretty heavy stuff, actually, we're holding. Does anyone know, when you think about brain-environment interactions, is there anything that comes to mind? Yes?
I know that talking in nature is meant to be very positive for your mental health.
Yes.
But the absence of that is the
Converse. So nature as a kind of mental health promoting, and what it means if we then don't have that. Yes, Lionel?
So what happens when the body, including your brain, is at a temperature which is above normal body temperature?
Very great question. What happens when your brain is above normal body temperature? That is a great segue. We're about to get into some of that. Yes?
I guess this condition of SAD, so seasonal affective disorder, and whether actually with the seasons changing with climate change, are more people going to be exposed to that sort of condition?
Yeah, really interesting. So seasonal affective disorder and this idea that actually, even without kind of a changing climate on top of that, just understanding how variance in our environment in different seasons can actually, affect. So it's not only a changing climate on top of that, but understanding these dynamics between our minds, our brains, and our wider context. So just as a little taster, where are we now? A few years ago, just to show how some of this wasn't being linked. So this was a couple of years ago. Shell was reporting its highest profits in 115 years, while at the same time, these were in the same week. This was on like the 2nd of February, 25th of January. Paramedics say people are getting ill because their homes are so cold. And the world was on brink of 5 disastrous climate tipping points. So at the same time, these articles are being written, but sometimes the dots are not necessarily being joined. So there's a lot of different narratives, and you guys spoke to some of them of what you're feeling when it comes to climate change. But you might read and hear about a lot of different narratives around anything from techno-optimism, so technology will fix the problem, to I'm too small to make a difference, to I should feel really guilty about every action that I take because all of them make a difference. No one else cares, or we're going to win or lose. This is like humanity will die, or we'll have to fix it in a certain amount of time. There's lots of different narratives around climate change. And so why do we need to understand the psychology? Just to say this in the words of Brian Eno as well, he said, the mistake we've made or we make with the climate movement is assume that humans are information processors. So we stick enough data in, they are bound to respond in one way or another, and that clearly hasn't worked. We know the information, but information is not changing our minds. Most people make decisions on the basis of feelings. So how do we change minds? A change in feelings changes minds. So it's not just about giving people the facts. We know in psychology that really doesn't work. But actually, there is an interplay between the state of the world and the state of our minds. And the narratives that we hold and are told influence our behavior. Our behavior then influences the state of our minds, the state of the world. And so we're locked in this kind of cycle. And at the moment, that can be in ways that you already started to outline, can be a bit of a vicious cycle. We had paralysis before, which is really understandable. But if people are overwhelmed, if they're stuck, if systems are breaking down, they're not able to take the actions that are needed. And that can affect the ability of individuals, communities, and systems to cope with and act on climate change. And we can get this kind of compounding impact. What is possible is to flip to a virtuous cycle. So if we can see that these challenges are interconnected, then interconnection leads to compounding impacts, but also compounding opportunities. And so if we can generate individual and system change, we can lead to these positive and compounding opportunities, which I'll touch on as well, and the evidence for that. So I've been lucky to work with thousands of people around the world over the last years, including as a Wellcome-funded project called Connecting Climate Minds. And we've heard what climate change looks like for people and communities around the world. And we hear some really sad stories. I know this is meant to be a fun event, so I won't go into too many of them. But just to say that climate change can look like many different things for many different people. It can look like farmers whose crops are failing more and more, having to move away from their familial lands. It can look like school days being lost because there's more and more heat waves and children can't go to school, or a compounding event. So it used to be that there would be a flood or there would be a fire and then there would be some chance to get over it. But what's happening now is that they're happening closer together, so there's no longer that chance to kind of fully recover before the next thing hits. And that is borne out in the data. So we're seeing that over time, there are more and more extreme weather events. And so climate change can look like gradual changes in the average climatic conditions, so slow rises in temperature, rises in sea levels, but also these more acute extreme weather events like floods, fires, but also chronic events like droughts. And what this leads to is a whole range of impacts. And again, this might not be new to anyone, but often these are reported without thinking about what does this do to the psyche of the people involved? What is the mental health fallout of dealing with direct loss and damage of your homes and property, direct experiences of high temperatures, like Lionel said before, or this flow-on effect to disruption to health or education systems, cultural practices, livelihoods, crop and livestock damage, forced migration, but also witnessing this, bearing witness to what's happening, knowing some of the science, knowing what's going on. And what we see, and what I'll come to, is that sadly, and maybe it's obvious once you start thinking about it, that if those things happen to you, those are traumatic, stressful events, and they cause both physiological stress, psychological stress, social stress, economic stress, all sorts of stresses that are kind of this risk multiplier. So it's not that these are new issues, but they're happening more frequently, more extremely, and it's compounding the risks for, sadly, deaths by suicide, new cases of mental illness, more susceptibility to physical ill health or death for people who already live with mental health conditions, and this worsened population mental health. I promise we'll get to good and happy stuff later. But just to say what that looks like for people is, again, this vicious cycle. So if there's a heat wave, there's a shortage of water, you don't get water, you go out looking for water, you bring the water, you get late to work, you don't get to work, you don't get paid, you can't feed your kids, you can't take care of your family. So it's a vicious cycle for people who have nothing much, and this causes mental health problems. So again, that might sound really obvious if you're in that context, but it's something that was largely missed from the context of climate change. I'm just going to dig into a few of the things that might be particularly surprising beyond those kind of obvious traumas and stresses. And one of them is what Lionel touched on, where it was very surprising to me, at least, when I started looking into this, beyond the kind of climate distress or distress from awareness, I had no idea after working at a crisis mental health text line that actually suicide risk rises with increasing temperature. And this is just one example, but there's data now from around the world. This is in mainland China. These relationships are non-linear. They depend on context. They depend on baseline temperatures. They depend on all other sorts of contextual factors. But we see this general trend. And sadly, what also happens with rising temperatures, and I again found this very surprising, was that people who live with mental health conditions are among those most at risk in a heat wave, say. So when we're thinking about public health policies, we don't just need to look at elderly, we don't just need to look at people with cardiac conditions or lung conditions. It's actually people living with schizophrenia who are the group most likely to die in the Canadian heat dome, for instance. And they represented more deaths than from any other disease. And data we have from the UK, when we asked people about their experience of heat in the UK, it was people living with mental health conditions who were most likely to say that their health had been worsened by heat than people living with cardiac or lung or other conditions. We also find, as I said, rising suicide risk, but we also see peaks in people going to hospital with psychiatric conditions in heat waves. So we see a jump of nearly 10% in a heat wave versus a non-heat wave period. So this is from a systematic review and meta-analysis that I led. And also we see poorer population mental health and well-being. And we see that even in Twitter data, when Twitter was still a thing, you can't access X data now, but when people were looking at sentiment, when the temperature was going up, positive sentiment went down and negative sentiment went up. This is what I was saying before, actually. So the people living with a mental health condition were the most likely in the UK as well to self-report that their own health had been impacted by hot weather. Why is that? So this is something that is not fully understood. There's many different hypotheses and probably a bunch of things are going on. One of them, for instance, is effects on sleep. So we experienced the heat wave a couple of weeks ago. When I was out and about, everyone around me was talking about, oh my gosh, are you sleeping? Have you got air conditioning? How are you feeling? I couldn't sleep. So, and we see this in global data, but it's not just the extreme heat. Actually, even if it's winter and there's a above average peak overnight, people don't sleep as well. So it's even these anomalous minimum temperatures. It's not just extreme temperatures where we see these effects. There's also a whole bunch of other reasons. So what we're hearing from people around the world is that when it's really hot, they don't go outside. So they become more socially isolated, they don't exercise, they're not doing their usual coping mechanisms for stress. There's more aggravation. So physiologically, when your brain gets hotter, people become much more irritable. There's like changes in blood flow and cognition. People become more violent, both sadly in the deaths by suicide, but also homicide, domestic violence. There's also interactions with medications people take, including for psychiatric conditions. And there's differences in cognition. So school kids don't do as well in exams when it's hotter. People working don't work as well. There's drops in economic output, etc. too. And that is not evenly distributed across society, which is a bit of a trend, sadly, with climate as well. So there's this risk multiplying effect. So it's the people who've done the least to cause the issues that are sadly burdened the most, often, both in terms of generationally and also in terms of wealth distribution. So the use of air conditioning, for instance, is great, but it can also create more heat in the surrounding areas. And people living in urban heat islands with less green space are more likely to be poorer, they're more likely to be living in overcrowded housing, less likely to have access to air conditioning, etc. And also this is happening with children not being able to go out. And this is a cartoon from the work we did in Central and South Asia, and people reporting that their children are like, can we go out and play? And they're saying, well, actually, you can't because it's dangerously hot outside. And going back to what does that mean for the brain? So this isn't only just a short-term thing. We're still trying to learn more about what that looks like, of those physiological stresses of the heat that's beyond what we're used to as humans. And it is really about also what people are used to. And there are some adaptations that can happen, but we're still learning how and where and in what ways. But importantly, it seems it's not just immediately, but there can be these cumulative effects. So sadly, I was talking to a colleague in this hall the other day. He was saying, for instance, that pregnant women are seeing a change in the ratio of girl to boy babies being born because there's more pregnancy losses with higher temperatures now in Africa, and that affects boy babies in the womb more. And we're also seeing that with exposure to temperature extremes, which is cold but also hot, then there can be lasting impacts on children's white matter development and also effects in utero. Heat also interacts with things like air pollution. So fossil fuel burning, also wildfire smoke. We know that that's really bad for the climate, but also it's really bad for our brains. So it's bad for every organ in our body, and our brain's not excluded from that, which we often think about, like impacts on lungs, for instance, impacts on asthma. what people don't necessarily think about is impacts on the rates of neurodevelopmental disorders, the rates of neurodegeneration, both across the life course and also kind of cumulatively. So, for instance, if you're exposed in childhood, there's an increased risk of schizophrenia, and higher air pollution days also lead to, sadly, more suicide as well. Again, I'll come to what the flip side of that means for if we take action on air pollution. Another maybe surprising finding is that in the context of these extreme weather events, it's not just the trauma that the people experience in that moment. There is this, like, some people recover, and resilience is really important as well, and there can even be post-traumatic growth, and we'll get to that, and communities coming together. But for some people, there's long-term mental health challenges, and it also seems that that's passed on generationally. So we're understanding more and more about kind of trauma and how that's passed on. But what happens now we're seeing is in utero, when this people who were exposed, so pregnant women who are exposed to Superstorm Sandy in the US versus like matched controls, their children went on to be more likely to develop depressive disorders, anxiety disorders, attention issues, and this seemed to also really compound if they were then exposed to heat and air pollution. So there is this kind of compounding risk. And that's kind of what this cartoon is meant to illustrate, that these things are happening not just in isolation. And in Australia, we're seeing this where there's more and more disasters, and unlike many other countries, the mental health data is collected more in Australia, so that's why I'm showing this as well. And again, even though it doesn't make the headlines, the vast majority of people who experience those disasters will go on to have some sort of mental health kind of fallout from that. And so these different challenges kind of interact. So there's this exposure to the extreme events. There's also this undermining of what we need to have good mental health and well-being. So like we said before, if we need access to nature, for instance, or we need access to culture, we need access to community, need access to good livelihoods, and that's taken away, then that's undermining those conditions. And then also all of this interacts with our psychological responses. You're all listening to me and having your own responses as you're listening. And just to touch on, all of this sits within the wider crises. And the reason that it's good to think about this is because we can come to this flip side that you said, if these issues have common causes and common consequences, then there's opportunities for acting in any of these spheres to have these ripple effects that have multiple benefits. But at this point in the talk, and hopefully I can change your minds, but at this point in the talk, you may be feeling like even more of that sense of like, oh gosh, like more bad news. And global instabilities, including climate change, and as I said, that sits in the context of many other things going on at the moment, it can feel like the future is getting worse. And actually, from indices that measure uncertainty, at least over the last 10 years, there is more global instability and uncertainty. And in general, human brains do not like uncertainty. So there have been neuroscientific experiments showing that uncertainty can trigger more stress than like a guaranteed bad outcome. So if you know that there's a 50% chance of getting an electric shock, for instance, that can be worse and generate more of a stress response than if you know 100% that you're going to get that electric shock. But it also interacts with learning. So it makes sense that it's more adaptive to be learning depending on how uncertain and unstable the environment is. You want to have like a higher learning rate as well. But in general, across mental health challenges, there is this kind of transdiagnostic factor of intolerance of uncertainty. So how good we are and how comfortable we can get at sitting in uncertainty is related to how good our mental health and well-being is going to be. And so with this uncertain future also comes an opportunity for transformation. And in a sense, to be hopeful means to be uncertain about the future and to be open to acting even when we don't know the outcome, and to recognize that we can never fully know the outcome, especially over very different timescales, but to be tender towards those possibilities and to sort of learn to sit in that uncertainty. And the IPCC reports, the International Panel of Climate Change, have talked about this in the context of resilience and in the context of developing a capacity for transformation. So this is where kind of the good news comes, is that because of all of those interconnections that I just outlined, when action happens in any of these domains, we're creating a world that's better for our mental health and well-being at the same time that we're making a world that's safer for our climate and environment. And that can basically goes across the board in many respects. So I'll give you some examples in a moment, but there's good data about improving the energy efficiency of housing, improving mental health and well-being, increasing active transport, improving mental health and well-being, increased provision to green and blue spaces, and we had before access to biodiversity. There's just more and more and more coming out about the value of that for our brains and minds. And also having strong social connection. Basically, we're learning that the quality of our relationships determines the quality of our health, the quality of our life. And if you're going to cope with a disaster, what we're hearing with people around the world, the stronger your communities, the better you're able to cope when bad things happen, and the better you're able to act and share learning and knowledge. And the communities that are adapting, transforming, coping with these adversities are the ones that are more strongly connected. So I'm just going to touch on a few of the things that might be a bit more surprising to you as well. So again, one that was surprising to me, when you don't realize how strongly what we breathe affects our health, China's air pollution action plan has been estimated to have prevented between 30,000 and 79,000, big wide number, but by suicide, deaths by suicide, which is around 10% of the decrease observed in China's suicide rate between 2013 and 2017. So who knows, as it continues, hopefully that trend has continued as well. So when policymakers think about public health measures for suicide prevention, I've never heard people in the context of mental health talking about suicide prevention as, oh, we should really do something about air pollution. But actually doing something about air pollution have a huge effect on suicide rates, also rates of all sorts of other mental health conditions and things like neurodegeneration, dementia, et cetera, which we know is rising a lot in society. And so obviously that will have a big cost outcome as well. And this is one example from Victoria in Australia. This was also done in Ireland, where they looked at essentially upgrading the energy efficiency of people's homes. And what they found in Victoria was when you did that, the indoor air temperature improved and people were using less energy to heat their homes. But what they also measured was, well, what happens to other sorts of outcomes? And what they found was people used healthcare less. People had higher self-reported well-being. They invited people into their homes more because they felt their home was more comfortable. They had less, and we're seeing in the UK and kind of analogous things, people have less fuel poverty pressures and less kind of economic stress, choosing, do I heat or eat, all of that. But interestingly, if you don't account for the healthcare benefits, which policy often doesn't, they're completely siloed, then you can't see these benefits, because what they found was that the savings were heavily weighted towards healthcare. So for every $1 saved in energy, $10 plus in Australian dollars was saved in health. So you've really got to account for those health benefits of kind of what are climate policies, and that's not always happening. We touched on, but just to say that this effect of nature is real as well. So there's more and more evidence coming out about this. But interestingly, again, it doesn't even matter if you like nature. It's great if you do. If you feel very connected to nature, then that is also protective, it seems like. So your sense of being a part of nature and not apart from nature can be very protective. It can also cause distress when you're seeing the landscapes around you change in negative ways, which I'll come to. But even when you send people out on a walk in nature or in a city and come back and compare, even the people who said, oh, I didn't really like walking in the woods, their kind of markers of cognitive performance and mood, etc., when they do these tests, actually go up more than the people who walked in the urban environments, even if they don't particularly like nature. And just to really hit home how interconnected and systemic these things are, this is from the International Panel of Climate Change, and they've shown that well-being for all, which is a very lofty goal, but this is really deeply interconnected with things like how much trust there is in societies, more effective governance, reduced emissions through wider participation in climate action, and equity. So what we see is that more unequal societies have higher emissions. They also have lower well-being. There's more crime. People are actually unhappier, even the richer people, when they're in more unequal societies. And so when we can work towards equality, we also get these benefits for emissions, potentially, well-being, so that, again, there's just these synergies that are not often accounted for. We've looked at this through Connecting Climate Minds. Just to say, if anyone's interested, you can check out this hub.connectingclimateminds.org, and there's like all these stories from people around the world and case studies and research and action agendas that have been created with different communities and all different global regions. And I just wanted to give you a sense of how this field is moving. So when I started in the field here, there was many aspects of this, like I said, youth mental health and climate change, where there was no papers. And there are only a few papers about a bunch of other things. Since I kind of joined the field, this has happened. And so it's been this huge uptick in the last years. And that has started to go into policy as well. So we published the first ever briefing paper on this, which created some international media coverage, which was great. Then we worked with the World Health Organization on their briefing the subsequent year. This was 5 years ago, that was 4 years ago. And we worked with the COP28 presidency. So COP is the Conference of Parties. It's bringing together all these different countries around the world to negotiate collectively on what action is going to be taken towards a safer climate. This International Panel of Climate Change, which are all of these different scientists and researchers from around the world giving like the best state-of-the-art evidence on both the impacts of climate change and what we need to do to stop climate change itself and also adapt to its effects. The latest version included mental health for the first time, and we worked with the COP30 presidency in Brazil to include mental health within their Belém Health Action Plan there. And we also worked, with the COP28 presidency to get mental health into the first declaration on climate and health. So there is movement. There's still a long way to go. When you look at national adaptation plans around the world or heat health action plans, the vast majority don't include any interventions to actually protect people with mental health challenges or to protect the health of the mental health of the population at large. So I'm going to change tack just a little bit to go from this kind of big picture to then what does this mean for you? Because I promised in the title of the talk a bit about what this means for you. And when I first started working in climate change and mental health, and you talk to people, it was very much focused on eco-anxiety. And this has absolutely gone through the roof in the last years in terms of people's awareness of, and certainly the media's use of this term. And so it's gone up by 4,500%. But people don't realize that it's actually quite a contested, still conceptually developing field. So something like eco-anxiety in the literature, there's 41 different definitions of what eco-anxiety is. One of the most used definitions is a chronic fear of environmental doom. There's also other terms that are emerging, such as solastalgia was coined in 2007, actually, by an Australian philosopher, putting together solace and nostalgia. And it's this feeling of being homesick when you're still at home. So the environment around you is changing in profoundly negative ways, and you no longer feel that solace you would have for your place and your home. There's also anticipated and real grief felt. But there's a whole range of psychological responses. We heard before things like terror, there's anger, there's guilt, there's frustration, there's denial. And these are all shaped by our connection to place, to broader social issues, cultural dynamics, and also our direct exposure to climate events. And it's also linked, this distress is also linked to the inaction of people in power rather than the climate itself. There is a misconception that eco-anxiety is only for rich, white, privileged people who don't have anything else to worry about. I think that conception is changing a bit, but it's certainly what I sort of heard before. And what we're seeing, though, in the data is that it's understandably the people that are experiencing this most who are the most worried. So in the Philippines, for instance, it's poorer and more vulnerable communities who have the highest levels of eco-anxiety. And in our data from the US, for instance, it's young people who've already directly experienced climate change exposures who also have the highest eco-anxiety. But again, it's not just what's happened, but also that sort of foreknowledge. So it's when we're kind of sitting in this, we're experiencing something, but then what does that mean then for what's to come? And we heard about how people are anticipatory, like grieving before things have actually happened. And this kind of compounding sense. So one disaster on top of another. And then this can lead to sort of a powerlessness. And we hear a lot that people are powerless. And we hear that just very quickly to say that from our data, for instance, in the pandemic, UK young people were more distressed about climate change than COVID. And those most distressed, so the top 10%, said they worried more frequently about climate change for their own future, even in the UK, than basically anything else in their life. And we see also that this is affecting people's future decisions, like whether or not to have children. And when we're seeing this show up more in clinics. So what do we do with that? What do we do with those feelings that you might be holding? Maybe this is something you experience. Maybe it's something you sometimes experience. Maybe you're not sure what to do. Maybe you feel powerless. So I'm just going to go through, to finish the talk, a few things that maybe you can do based on the evidence. I'm happy to go through these in questions. One thing is to know that you're not alone. Whatever you're feeling, there's this huge range of responses, and we see that people feel a lot of things at once, and those go up and down. But we have this huge perception gap. So often people feel alone and powerless, and that really keeps us stuck in the status quo and is a barrier to action. But the vast majority of people actually want change. So there was data in America, it's also in Australia and now globally, that the vast majority of people support climate policies and climate action, but they think they're in the minority. There's also widespread support to even pay from your salary towards climate action. But again, this is this huge perception gap where people are like, well, I would, but no one else would. And in game theory experiments, people will often collaborate more with each other and give up, make more sacrifices towards climate action as well. But then they, again, underestimate how many other people in the game have done that. So number one was really talk to people. More people care than you realize. Talk to people. Number two, you don't have to pick a side between hope and despair. And the evidence around coping suggests that the strategy that's most aligned with high well-being and high action is something called meaning-focused coping. So you can do things in line with your values, and you can realize you can do something. You also can't do everything, and you do it with others. But it's also important to note that people often feel they have to choose hope or despair, but both are happening at once. Both stories are true. And so we can sit in that paradox and sit in the uncertainty and hold them together. And that learning to do that has big benefits for our rest of our life as well. One of those is just our capacity to feel, because actually when we're trying to, people think sometimes that if they start feeling about this, it's going to be overwhelming, and it might be initially, but when you allow yourself to really feel the grief, you also allow yourself to feel the joy and to really realize that that's connected to your care for the world. And so if we're diverting energy to kind of disconnect from what's happening, then we're depleting the resilience and imagination needed for fresh visions and strategies. Number three, your actions can change your emotions. A lot of people, and this is true for life in general, think that I need to feel like I want to go for a run before I'm going to go for a run, or I need to feel like I need to know the outcome, that I'm not going to do any action before I can prove that it's going to save the world. Whereas actually, once we start acting, that creates a lot of momentum, and it also changes our own beliefs in our agency, it changes our emotions, and it can be really good for us. And agency is social. We need to see it to kind of believe it and to act. So what you do can kind of spread a lot through these networks. And share the stories of action that build agency, because action begets action. Number four, think about where you touch power. So a lot of us feel powerless, but everyone has influence over other people, especially all of you in this room. That includes where your money is, where your pension is, whether or not that is funding fossil fuels, for instance. And what we see again is taking action with others. Collective action seems to be the best buffer of poor mental health and the best boost to mental health. And people get a lot of joy, but you also, if you change your workplace, your school, your community, what we're seeing around the world is that really spreads. And one example of this is a group of law students who were in a Pacific island who were learning about what was happening, and they were like, we need to do something. They then got the government of Vanuatu on board. They went to the UN. They ended up going to the International Court of Justice and getting a unanimous decision last year from the International Court of Justice that the production and consumption of fossil fuels may constitute an internationally wrongful act attributable to that state. So the highest court in the world has basically said that countries can be liable legally for the fossil fuels that they're continuing to exploit and burn in terms of how it's impacting other countries. And this was started by a group of law students who were like, yeah, we don't think that this is good. We want to do something about it together. And finally, the changes that are good for the planet are often good for you too. And we see that pro-environmental behavior is related to higher well-being and meaning in life. So basically, if you're doing things for yourself in line with your values, finding meaning even in the context of adversity, and not needing everything to be okay before you act, you can create hope through your actions and find meaning and purpose even within what can be a difficult time. So finally, there's absolutely no excuse for making our passionate love for the world dependent on what we think of its degree of health, dependent on knowing the outcome beforehand. But in this moment, you're alive, and we can all do stuff together. So at this moment, we'll let you go and eat dinner. But thank you very much.